The morning I decided to trust Evangeline Thorne with my 8-month-old son Orion was the morning that would unravel every assumption I'd held about the people closest to me. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because the story really begins 3 weeks earlier, when my husband Lysander first mentioned the girl next door. "Seraphina, have you met the Thorne's daughter?" he asked over breakfast, his voice carrying that particular tone he used when he was working towards something. I was bouncing Orion on my lap while trying to eat my cooling oatmeal, and our 6-year-old daughter Isadora was methodically removing all the raisins from her cereal bowl, arranging them in perfect rows on her napkin. "Evangeline? I've seen her around," I replied, shifting Orion to my other arm when he started fussing. "Why?" "She's 17, very responsible according to Margaret Thorne. Apparently she helps care for her grandmother who has dementia. Margaret thinks she'd make an excellent babysitter." Lysander folded his newspaper with precise movements, the way he did everything. Measured, deliberate, calculated. "We could use the help, don't you think?" I studied my husband's face, searching for the subtext that always seemed to lurk beneath his suggestions. After 12 years of marriage, I'd learned that Lysander never presented ideas without having already mapped out their implementation. His dark hair was perfectly styled even at 7 in the morning, his blue eyes bright with the kind of energy that suggested he'd been awake for hours planning his day. Everything about Lysander was intentional, from his carefully curated wardrobe to the way he arranged his home office with military precision. "We've managed fine without help," I said carefully, watching as Isadora began eating her raisins one by one, her small face scrunched in concentration. My daughter had inherited my auburn hair, but her father's intensity, and she approached even breakfast with the kind of focus that sometimes worried me. "Have we, though?" Lysander's question hung in the air between us like a challenge. "You're exhausted, Seraphina. You're trying to manage a baby, a 6-year-old, and the house, and it's taking a toll. When's the last time you had 2 hours to yourself?" The question stung because it was fair. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt fully rested, the last time I'd finished a conversation without being interrupted by a crying baby or a child needing attention. My reflection in the bathroom mirror each morning showed dark circles under my green eyes, and my once thick hair seemed to be thinning from stress and sleepless nights. "Mommy looks tired," Isadora said suddenly, her perceptive comment causing both Lysander and me to turn toward her. She was regarding me with those serious blue eyes that seemed far too knowing for a 6-year-old. "Your face looks sad even when you're smiling." From the mouths of babes. I felt heat rise in my cheeks as I realized how transparent my exhaustion must be if even Isadora had noticed. "See?" Lysander said gently, reaching across the table to squeeze my free hand. "It wouldn't hurt to have someone reliable we could call occasionally. Just for a few hours here and there so you can rest or run errands without juggling both kids." The logic was sound, I had to admit. But something about the timing felt orchestrated. Lysander had been working longer hours at his architectural firm lately, taking on projects that kept him at the office until well past dinner time. When he was home, he was often distracted, checking his phone constantly, or retreating to his home office to make what he called urgent calls. The idea of hiring help felt less like genuine concern for my well-being, and more like a solution to a problem I didn't fully understand yet. "I suppose it wouldn't hurt to meet her," I conceded, immediately regretting the words when I saw the satisfied expression that flickered across Lysander's features. "Excellent. I'll ask Margaret to send her over this weekend. You can get to know each other, see if it feels like a good fit." That conversation took place on a Tuesday morning in early October, when the leaves outside our suburban home were just beginning to turn golden, and the air carried the first hint of winter's approach. By the following Saturday, I was sitting across from Evangeline Thorne in my living room, trying to reconcile the polite, soft-spoken teenager with the growing unease that had been building in my chest all week. Evangeline was beautiful in that effortless way that some teenage girls possess, all long limbs and clear skin and hair that fell in natural waves past her shoulders. She wore minimal makeup, just enough to enhance features that didn't really need enhancing, and her clothes were simple but well-fitted. Dark jeans, a cream-colored sweater, brown boots that looked expensive but not flashy. Everything about her suggested good breeding and careful attention to detail. "I've been babysitting since I was 14, she was telling me, her voice soft and measured. "I have CPR certification and first aid training. I helped raise my two younger cousins when they lived with us for a year, so I'm comfortable with infants." Orion was napping upstairs, and Isadora was in the backyard on her swing set, occasionally visible through the kitchen window as she pumped, her legs with determined concentration. The house felt unusually quiet, almost expectant, as if it too was waiting to see how this interview would unfold. "Tell me about your experience with your grandmother," I said, settling back in my chair and studying Evangeline's face. "Lysander mentioned that you help care for her." A shadow crossed Evangeline's features, something that might have been sadness or frustration, before her composed expression returned. "Grandma Rose has been living with us for 3 years now. She has moderate dementia, so she needs constant supervision. I help with meals, medication reminders, and I sit with her when my parents need to run errands. It's taught me patience and how to stay calm in unpredictable situations." The answer was perfect. Too perfect, perhaps. It demonstrated maturity, responsibility, and practical experience, exactly what any parent would want to hear from a potential babysitter. Yet something about the way Evangeline delivered it felt rehearsed, as if she'd given this exact speech multiple times before. "That must be challenging," I said, probing gently. "Caring for someone with dementia while you're still in school." "It is," Evangeline agreed, and for a moment her composure cracked just enough to let me see something raw underneath. "But family takes care of family, right? That's what my parents taught me." The comment struck me as oddly mature for a 17-year-old, the kind of resignation that came from shouldering adult responsibilities too early. I found myself wondering what Evangeline's own childhood had looked like, whether she'd had time to simply be a teenager, or if she'd been pressed into service as a caregiver before she was ready. "What do you like to do for fun?" I asked, shifting the conversation toward lighter territory. "I read a lot," she said, brightening slightly. "I love old novels, especially 19th century literature. Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, George Eliot. I'm hoping to study English literature in college next year." "Where are you planning to apply?" "Several places. Some state schools, a few private colleges if I can manage the financial aid." She paused, then added with careful casualness, "Your husband actually wrote me a recommendation letter. He said he was impressed with how responsible I've been helping my family." This was news to me. Lysander hadn't mentioned writing a recommendation letter for Evangeline, and the omission felt significant. When had he gotten to know her well enough to assess her responsibility? And why hadn't he mentioned it during our breakfast conversation when he was advocating for hiring her? "That was kind of him," I said, keeping my voice neutral while my mind raced. "He didn't mention it to me." "Oh," Evangeline looked momentarily flustered. "I hope that's okay. I asked him a few weeks ago when I saw him getting the mail. He said he'd be happy to help since we're neighbors, and he knew about my situation with Grandma Rose." The explanation was reasonable, but it left me with more questions than answers. Lysander was not typically the type of person to offer assistance to relative strangers, especially when it came to something as significant as a college recommendation. His generosity, when it appeared, usually came with strings attached or served some purpose I didn't immediately understand. The interview continued for another 20 minutes, covering practical details about rates, availability, and emergency procedures. Evangeline answered every question thoughtfully and thoroughly, demonstrating exactly the kind of competence and maturity that should have put me at ease. Instead, I found myself studying her face for signs of deception, listening for inconsistencies in her story, searching for some rational explanation for the persistent unease that had been growing since Lysander first suggested hiring her. When Evangeline left that afternoon, promising to call later that week to arrange a trial babysitting session, I stood at the front window watching her walk across our shared property line to the Thorne house. It was a modest, two-story colonial painted pale yellow with white trim, surrounded by carefully maintained gardens that spoke to Margaret Thorne's love of gardening. I'd lived next door to the Thornes for 6 years, ever since Lysander and I bought our house, but I realized I knew very little about their family beyond casual neighborly exchanges. Margaret Thorne was a pleasant woman in her early 50s who worked as a nurse at the local hospital. Her husband David was some kind of engineer who traveled frequently for work. They'd always seemed like quiet, reliable neighbors, the kind of people who kept their lawn mowed and never played music too loudly. I'd seen Evangeline around over the years, of course, but always at a distance. She'd been just another neighborhood teenager, unremarkable in the way that other people's children tend to be when you're focused on raising your own. "How did it go?" Lysander asked when he returned from his Saturday afternoon run, still breathing hard from his 5-mile circuit through our neighborhood. Sweat darkened his gray t-shirt, and his hair was messed from the wind, making him look younger and less controlled than usual. "Fine," I said, handing him a water bottle and trying to organize my thoughts. "She seems very mature, very responsible. But—" He caught the hesitation in my voice immediately, the way he always did. Lysander was an excellent reader of people. It was one of the skills that made him successful in his architectural practice, his ability to understand what clients wanted, even when they couldn't articulate it themselves. "No, but," I said, then reconsidered. "Actually, yes, there is a but. She mentioned that you wrote her a college recommendation letter." Lysander went very still, the water bottle halfway to his lips. For just a moment, I saw something flicker across his face, surprise perhaps, or annoyance, before his expression smoothed into neutrality. "She asked me a few weeks ago," he said, taking a long drink of water. "I ran into her when I was checking the mail, and she mentioned she was applying to colleges. It seemed like a small thing to do for a neighbor. You didn't mention it to me, didn't I?" He was already moving toward the stairs, signaling the end of the conversation. I must have forgotten. It was just a simple character reference, nothing elaborate. I watched him disappear upstairs, presumably to shower, and felt the familiar frustration that came from conversations with my husband that felt incomplete. Lysander had always been skilled at providing just enough information to answer a question without really answering it, at deflecting curiosity with reasonable explanations that left no room for follow-up without seeming unreasonably suspicious. That evening, after Isadora was in bed and Orion was finally sleeping peacefully in his crib, I found myself standing at the kitchen window that faced the Thorne house. Most of their windows were lit, creating warm rectangles of yellow light in the gathering darkness. I could see movement in what appeared to be their living room, figures passing back and forth, the occasional gesture of conversation. It looked like any normal family evening, unremarkable and domestic. "Serafina?" Lysander's voice behind me made me startle. "What are you looking at?" "Nothing really," I said, turning away from the window. "Just thinking." "About what?" The question felt loaded, as if my answer might reveal more than I intended. "About whether we really need a babysitter, whether it's worth complicating our routine." Lysander moved behind me, placing his hands on my shoulders and kneading gently at the tension that had taken up permanent residence there. "You're overthinking this," he said, his voice warm against my ear. "Evangeline is a sweet girl who could use the money, and we could use the help. It doesn't have to be more complicated than that." But as I leaned back against my husband's chest, feeling the solid warmth of him and breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne, I couldn't shake the feeling that it already was more complicated than that. There were undercurrents in our house that I couldn't quite identify, tensions that seemed to hum just below the surface of our daily routines. Lysander's work schedule had become increasingly erratic, his mood more volatile, swinging between intense focus and distracted preoccupation. He'd started receiving phone calls at odd hours, conversations he took in his office with the door closed. When I asked about them, he'd explain them away as client emergencies or project deadlines, but the explanations felt hollow. The following week, I called Evangeline and arranged for her to babysit Orion for 2 hours on Thursday afternoon, while I took Isadora to her after-school art class. It seemed like a safe first trial, a short time frame, a simple task, and Isadora would be with me in case anything went wrong. What could possibly happen in 2 hours? Thursday morning dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of October weather that made everything feel slightly ominous. I'd slept poorly the night before, startling awake every time Orion made a sound, as if my subconscious was already preparing for something to go wrong. Lysander had left early for a breakfast meeting with a client, kissing me goodbye while I was still half asleep and promising to be home by dinner. Isadora seemed unusually quiet during breakfast, picking at her cereal and staring out the window at the rain, with an expression that looked almost adult in its contemplation. "Are you feeling okay, sweetheart?" I asked, reaching across the table to feel her forehead for fever. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice lacked its usual energy. "Mommy, do I have to go to art class today?" "You love art class," I reminded her. "Mrs. Patterson said you're one of her most talented students." "I know, but—" Isadora trailed off, then shook her head. "Never mind." "But what?" "Tell me what you're thinking." "I don't want to leave Orion with the babysitter," she said finally, her blue eyes serious and worried. "What if something happens while we're gone?" The comment surprised me. Isadora had always been protective of her baby brother, but she'd never expressed anxiety about leaving him with other people before. She'd been perfectly content when my mother babysat, or when Lysander's sister watched both children during our rare date nights. "What do you think might happen?" I asked gently, trying to understand the source of her concern. "I don't know," Isadora said, her small shoulders hunching. "I just have a bad feeling." Children's intuition was something I'd learned to take seriously over the years. Isadora had always been sensitive to emotional undercurrents, picking up on tensions and changes that adults missed or chose to ignore. When she was 4, she'd refused to go near my father for 3 months before we discovered he was having an affair. When she was 5, she'd cried inconsolably every time we visited Lysander's mother, weeks before we learned about her early-stage dementia diagnosis. "What kind of bad feeling?" I pressed, sitting down next to her and giving her my full attention. Isadora was quiet for a long moment, her small face scrunched in concentration as she tried to put her concerns into words. "Remember when we went to the zoo last month and we saw that snake in the glass case? It looked pretty and sleepy, but you said some snakes were dangerous even when they seemed harmless." The comparison sent a chill down my spine. "Are you talking about Evangeline?" "Maybe," Isadora said uncertainly. "I don't know why, but when I see her, I think about that snake." I wanted to dismiss the comment as childhood imagination, the kind of vague anxiety that sometimes accompanied new situations. But something about the way Isadora had phrased it, the careful thoughtfulness of her analogy, made me pause. My daughter was not given to dramatic pronouncements or attention-seeking behavior. When she expressed concerns, they usually had some basis in reality. "Has Evangeline said or done something to make you uncomfortable?" I asked. "No," Isadora said quickly. "She's always nice to me. She smiles and asks about school and tells me I'm pretty. But—" Another pause. Another struggle to articulate something that didn't quite have words. "But what, sweetheart?" "But her smiles don't reach her eyes," Isadora said finally, like when people pretend to be happy but they're really thinking about something else. I stared at my 6-year-old daughter, wondering when she'd become so perceptive about human nature, so skilled at reading the subtleties of adult behavior. It was both impressive and unsettling, this premature wisdom that seemed to be developing in her. Despite Isadora's reservations, I decided to proceed with the babysitting arrangement. My rational mind insisted that I was projecting my own anxiety onto the situation, allowing my daughter's imagination to feed my groundless concerns. Evangeline had been nothing but professional and competent during our interview. Her references were excellent. She had practical experience caring for vulnerable people. There was no logical reason to cancel. Evangeline arrived at exactly 1 o'clock, punctual and prepared with a small bag containing activities and emergency contact information. She'd clearly given thought to how she would spend the afternoon with Orion, bringing age-appropriate toys and books that suggested genuine understanding of infant development. He usually takes a bottle around 2:30, I explained, showing her around the kitchen and reviewing the routine we'd established. And if he gets fussy, sometimes walking around the living room while holding him helps him settle down. Of course, Evangeline said, taking notes in a small notebook she'd brought. What about his nap schedule? He's been fighting naps lately, but if you can get him down around 3, that would be wonderful. His room is upstairs, second door on the right. I was impressed by her thoroughness, the professional way she approached the responsibility. Watching her interact with Orion, I could see why her family trusted her with complex caregiving duties. She was gentle but confident, speaking to him in the kind of soft, soothing voice that seemed to calm him immediately. "We'll be back by 3:30, I said, gathering my purse and Isadora's art supplies. My cell phone number is on the refrigerator, and Lysander's office number is there too, though he's in meetings most of the afternoon. We'll be fine, Evangeline assured me, settling into the living room chair with Orion in her arms. Take your time. Orion and I are going to have a wonderful afternoon together. Something about the way she said it, the emphasis on wonderful, perhaps, or the satisfied expression that crossed her face, made me hesitate at the front door. But Isadora was already in the car, strapped into her booster seat and waiting with the patient resignation of a child who'd learned not to question adult decisions, even when they made her uncomfortable. The drive to Isadora's art class took 15 minutes through our quiet suburban neighborhood, past houses that looked similar to ours, 2-story colonials and sprawling ranches with carefully maintained lawns and seasonal decorations that marked the progression from summer to fall. The art studio was located in a converted warehouse on the edge of downtown, a bright, cheerful space filled with natural light and the creative chaos of children's artwork. Mrs. Patterson greeted us at the door with her usual enthusiasm, a tiny woman in her 70s whose white hair was perpetually dusted with paint and whose energy seemed inexhaustible. She'd been teaching children's art classes for 40 years, and she had an intuitive understanding of how to nurture creativity while maintaining just enough structure to prevent complete anarchy. Isadora, I'm so excited to see what you create today, she said, leading us into the main studio where a dozen other children were already settling in at their workstations. We're working on landscapes today, learning about perspective and depth. I watched Isadora take her seat at a table near the window, arranging her supplies with the same careful precision she brought to everything. She looked small among the other children, most of whom were older and more boisterous, but she moved with quiet confidence as she prepared to work. She's one of my most naturally gifted students, Mrs. Patterson told me quietly as we watched Isadora begin sketching. She has an unusual ability to see relationships between colors and shapes. It's quite remarkable for someone her age. She's always been observant, I said, thinking about our breakfast conversation and Isadora's uncanny ability to read people's hidden emotions. Artists often are, Mrs. Patterson replied. They see things others miss. I left Isadora at the studio with plans to return at 3:15, giving myself enough time to collect her and get back home by 3:30 as promised. The grocery store was my intended destination, a mundane errand that felt luxurious when undertaken without a baby carrier and diaper bag. But I found myself driving aimlessly through town instead, too restless to focus on shopping. My phone remained silent in my purse, which I took as a good sign. No news was good news when it came to babysitting arrangements. If Evangeline needed help, or if something was wrong with Orion, she would call. The fact that she hadn't suggested that everything was proceeding smoothly. At 2:45, I pulled into the parking lot of the art studio, early enough to watch the end of Isadora's class through the large windows that faced the street. I could see her at her table, focused intently on her work, occasionally pausing to consider her next move. Even from a distance, I could tell she was creating something special, her usual careful attention elevated to an almost meditative concentration. When the class ended at 3:15, Isadora emerged from the studio carrying a large sheet of paper that she held carefully to prevent smudging. Her face was animated in a way I hadn't seen all week, lit up with the satisfaction that came from successful creative expression. "Let me see," I said as she climbed into the car, but she shook her head and clutched the paper protectively. "I want to show it to you at home," she said. "It's a surprise." "Did you have a good time?" "Yes," she said, but then her expression grew serious again. "Mommy, can we go home now?" "Right now?" "That's exactly what we're doing," I said, starting the car and pulling out of the parking lot. "We'll be home in 15 minutes. "No, I mean right now," Isadora insisted, her voice taking on an urgent quality that made me glance at her in the rearview mirror. "Something's wrong. We need to go home right now." "What do you mean something's wrong? Did you hurt yourself in class?" "Not with me," she said, her eyes wide and frightened. "At home, with Orion." "Mommy, please, can we hurry?" I felt my heart rate spike as I heard the genuine fear in my daughter's voice. Isadora was not prone to dramatics or attention-seeking behavior. When she said something was wrong, it usually was. "Sweetheart, what makes you think something's wrong at home?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm while my mind raced through possibilities. "Did you have a bad dream in class?" Sometimes when we're worried about something, our imagination can make it seem. "It's not my imagination," Isadora interrupted, her voice rising toward panic. "Something bad is happening to Orion right now. I can feel it. Please, Mommy, please let's go home." The certainty in her voice, the absolute conviction that her baby brother was in danger, made my blood run cold. I pressed harder on the accelerator, suddenly desperate to get home and confirm that everything was fine, that Evangeline was competently caring for Orion just as she'd promised, that my daughter's anxiety was unfounded. But as we turned onto our street and I saw our house in the distance, I noticed that something did look different. Evangeline's car was still in our driveway, which was good. It meant she hadn't abandoned her post. But there was something about the house itself that seemed off, though I couldn't immediately identify what it was. "Hurry, Mommy," Isadora pleaded from the back seat, her voice thick with tears now. "Please hurry." I pulled into our driveway and turned off the engine, my hands shaking slightly as I fumbled with my keys. The front of the house looked normal. The porch light was off, the curtains were drawn, the lawn looked the same as it had when we'd left 2.5 hours earlier. But there was something in the air, some invisible tension that made my skin prickle with unease. "Stay in the car for just a minute," I told Isadora, but she was already unbuckling her seatbelt. "No, I'm coming with you," she said firmly. "Orion needs both of us." We walked to the front door together, Isadora's small hand gripping mine with surprising strength. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as I slipped my key into the lock, turned it, and slowly pushed the door open. The house was completely silent, not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping baby, but an oppressive stillness that seemed to press against my eardrums like a held breath. Even Isadora seemed to sense it, her grip on my hand tightening as we stepped across the threshold into our own home that suddenly felt foreign and threatening. "Evangeline?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. "We're back." No response, no footsteps, no voice calling back a cheerful greeting, no sound of movement from any part of the house. The living room looked exactly as we'd left it, the same throw pillows arranged on the couch, the same magazines fanned across the coffee table, the same afternoon light slanting through the windows. But the absence of human presence felt almost tangible. "Where is everyone?" Isadora whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm sure they're fine," I said, but the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Maybe Evangeline took Orion for a walk around the backyard, or maybe they're both napping upstairs. But even as I offered these reasonable explanations, my maternal instincts were screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. The house felt empty in a way that suggested we were alone, truly alone, despite Evangeline's car still sitting in our driveway. I moved through the living room toward the kitchen, calling Evangeline's name again, louder this time. The kitchen was spotless, exactly as I'd left it, with no signs that anyone had prepared a bottle or cleaned up after feeding a baby. The notebook where Evangeline had been taking careful notes about Orion's routine lay closed on the counter, her pen beside it as if she'd simply walked away mid-sentence. "Check the backyard," I told Isadora, though my voice was beginning to shake with an anxiety I could no longer suppress. "See if you can see them through the window." Isadora ran to the sliding glass door that led to our deck, pressing her face against the glass. "Nobody's out there, Mommy." The swing is still, and I don't see any footprints in the grass. I was already moving toward the stairs, taking them two at a time while my heart hammered against my ribs. "Evangeline? Orion?" I called out as I reached the landing, but the second floor felt as empty as the first. Orion's nursery door was closed, which was unusual. I always left it slightly ajar when he was sleeping to better hear if he woke up. I pushed it open with trembling fingers and felt my world tilt sideways. The crib was empty. Not just empty, but stripped of its bedding, the mattress bare except for the fitted sheet that had been pulled askew as if someone had grabbed the blankets in haste. The mobile that hung above the crib was still spinning slowly, as if it had been touched recently, but there was no sign of my baby son. "Orion!" I called out desperately, rushing to check behind the crib, under the changing table, in the closet, anywhere an 8-month-old might possibly be hidden. "Orion!" Isadora appeared in the doorway, her face pale with terror. "Mommy, where's Orion? Where's the babysitter?" I couldn't answer her because I didn't know, and the not knowing was threatening to overwhelm my ability to think rationally. My baby was gone. The teenager I'd trusted to care for him had vanished. And my husband, who had suggested hiring her in the first place, was unreachable in meetings across town. "Stay right here," I told Isadora, though my voice was shaking so badly I wasn't sure she could understand me. "Don't move from this spot while I check the other rooms." I searched every room on the second floor with increasing desperation. Our master bedroom, the guest room, the bathroom, even the linen closet. No Evangeline, no Orion, no clues about where they might have gone or why. The house felt like a stage set after the actors had departed, full of props but empty of life. Back downstairs, I grabbed my phone from my purse and dialed Evangeline's number with shaking fingers. It went straight to voicemail. I tried again, then a third time, but the result was the same. Her phone was either turned off or deliberately silenced. "Think, Serafina," I whispered to myself, trying to force my panic-stricken mind to function logically. There has to be an explanation. But every explanation I could imagine was worse than the last. Had Evangeline taken Orion somewhere without permission? Had there been an emergency that required a trip to the hospital? Had someone else come to the house and taken them both? The possibilities multiplied in my mind like a virus, each more terrifying than the last. I called Lysander's office number, my fingers barely able to hit the correct digits on my phone's keypad. His secretary, a polite woman named Patricia, answered on the second ring. "Serafina, how nice to hear from you. How can I help you today? I need to speak to Lysander immediately, I said, struggling to keep my voice from dissolving into hysteria. It's an emergency. Oh dear, I'm so sorry, but he's not in the office today. He canceled all his afternoon meetings and left around noon. I assumed he was heading home. Didn't he tell you? The room started spinning around me. Lysander had left work at noon, but he hadn't come home. He'd told me he would be in meetings all afternoon, but his secretary said he'd canceled everything, which meant he'd been lying to me again about something that now seemed connected to my missing baby. Did he say where he was going? I managed to ask. No, he just said something urgent had come up. Is everything all right, Serafina? You sound upset. I hung up without answering and immediately dialed Lysander's cell phone. It went to voicemail after one ring, the way it did when someone deliberately declined a call. I tried again, but he wasn't answering. Isadora had crept downstairs and was hovering in the kitchen doorway, watching me with eyes that seemed far too adult for her 6-year-old face. Daddy's not answering either, is he? She said quietly. The question hit me like a physical blow because it revealed how much my daughter had already understood about the situation. She wasn't just worried about her missing brother. She was starting to piece together the same terrible possibilities that were forming in my own mind. Sweetheart, I need you to do something very important for me, I said, kneeling down to her level and taking her small hands in mine. I need you to go to Mrs. Patterson's house next door and ask her to call the police. Can you do that? Are Daddy and the babysitter stealing Orion? Isadora asked, her voice so matter-of-fact that it made my blood freeze. The directness of her question, the casual way she linked her father to Evangeline's disappearance, told me that she'd been observing things I'd missed or chosen to ignore. Children saw patterns that adults rationalized away, noticed connections that seemed too impossible to acknowledge. I don't know what's happening, I told her honestly, but I'm going to find out. Right now, I need you to be very brave and go get help while I figure out where your brother is. Isadora nodded solemnly and headed for the front door, moving with the purposeful determination of someone much older than her years. As I watched her cross our front yard toward Mrs. Patterson's house, I felt a mixture of pride and heartbreak, proud of her courage and devastated that she was being forced to grow up too quickly because of adult failures she shouldn't have to witness. Once Isadora was safely at the neighbors, I began searching the house more systematically, looking not just for signs of Orion and Evangeline, but for clues about what might have happened. In the living room, I noticed that the throw pillows on the couch had been rearranged slightly, as if someone had been sitting there recently. The remote control for the television was on the coffee table rather than on the side table where I always left it. In the kitchen, I found the first real evidence that something significant had occurred during our absence. The refrigerator door bore fresh fingerprints around the handle, and when I opened it, I saw that the baby bottles I'd prepared for Orion were still there, untouched. If Evangeline had been caring for him properly, she would have used at least one bottle during the 2.5 hours we'd been gone. But it was in Lysander's home office that I found the discovery that changed everything. The office door was closed, which was unusual. Lysander typically left it open unless he was having a private conversation. When I pushed it open, I immediately noticed that his normally immaculate desk was in disarray. Papers were scattered across the surface, filing cabinet drawers were slightly ajar, and his computer was still on, displaying a screen I'd never seen before. I moved closer to the computer, my heart pounding as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The screen showed what appeared to be a financial account, but not one I recognized. The account holder was listed as L. Montague, not Lysander's real name, but close enough to suggest deliberate deception rather than coincidence. The account contained over $200,000. I scrolled through the transaction history with trembling fingers, trying to understand where this money had come from and why my husband had a secret bank account under a false name. The deposits were irregular but substantial, ranging from $5,000 to $15,000, and they'd been occurring for over 2 years. The most recent deposit had been made just 3 days ago. Below the banking information, I found a folder on the desktop labeled EC, Evangeline's initials. When I clicked on it, my worst fears began to crystallize into horrible reality. The folder contained photographs, dozens of them. Pictures of our house taken from different angles, showing windows, doors, and security system components. Pictures of our daily routines, me leaving with Isadora for school, Lysander departing for work, our typical schedule patterns mapped out in visual detail. And most disturbing of all, pictures of Orion. My baby son photographed without my knowledge, sleeping in his crib, playing in his bouncy seat, being carried around the house in my arms. Someone had been surveillance our family for months, documenting our habits and vulnerabilities with the kind of systematic attention that suggested serious planning. And based on the folder's name and the timing of its creation, that someone was working with Evangeline. Underneath the photographs, I found printed emails between two accounts I didn't recognize. The messages were brief and coded, but their meaning became clear as I read through them. Package will be ready for pickup Thursday afternoon between 1 and 4 p.m. Understood. Transportation arranged. Payment transferred as discussed. Confirmed delivery location remains unchanged. Confirmed. See you at the usual place. The final email had been sent yesterday, just 24 hours before Evangeline was scheduled to babysit Orion for the first time. The timestamp showed it had been sent from Lysander's computer. My husband, the man I'd shared a bed with for 12 years, the father of my children, the person I'd trusted more than anyone else in the world, had been planning to sell our baby. The realization hit me like a physical blow, so shocking and incomprehensible that for a moment I couldn't breathe. The room spun around me as I tried to process the magnitude of the betrayal, not just infidelity or financial deception, but something so fundamentally evil that my mind struggled to accept it as reality. But the evidence was right there in front of me, undeniable and damning. The secret bank account, the surveillance photos, the coded communications, the timing of Evangeline's introduction into our lives, everything fit together with the horrible precision of a carefully orchestrated plan. I heard the front door open and the sound of multiple voices in the foyer, Mrs. Patterson's concerned tones mixing with the authoritative voices of police officers. Isadora had successfully summoned help, but I wasn't sure that even the police would be able to navigate the complexity of what we were dealing with. "Ma'am?" A police officer appeared in the doorway of the office, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone accustomed to dealing with domestic crises. "I'm Officer Rodriguez. Your neighbor said you're missing a child?" "My 8-month-old son," I said, my voice sounding strangely calm despite the chaos in my mind. "And I think I know who took him." I gestured toward the computer screen, toward the evidence of betrayal that painted my husband as a stranger I'd never really known. "My husband has been planning this. He hired the babysitter, he arranged everything, and now they're both gone with my baby." Officer Rodriguez moved closer to examine the computer screen, his expression growing more serious as he absorbed the implications of what he was seeing. "Ma'am, these are very serious allegations. Are you certain your husband is involved in your son's disappearance?" "Look at the evidence," I said, pointing to the transaction history, the photographs, the email communications. "This has been planned for months. The babysitter was never meant to care for Orion. She was meant to take him." As I spoke the words aloud, the full horror of the situation crystallized in my mind. Lysander hadn't just betrayed our marriage. He'd betrayed our children, selling one of them like property while using the other as an unwitting accomplice to establish trust and routine. The recommendation letter he'd written for Evangeline, the casual way he'd suggested hiring her, his insistence that I needed help despite my protests, all of it had been calculated steps toward this moment. "We need to find them immediately," I continued, my voice gaining strength as my shock transformed into determination. "They could be anywhere by now, and whoever is buying my son is expecting delivery today. Officer Rodriguez was already reaching for his radio, calling for backup and issuing an alert for both Lysander's car and Evangeline's vehicle. We're going to need descriptions of everyone involved, license plate numbers, any information you have about possible destinations. As I provided the necessary details, another police officer was photographing the computer screen and documenting the evidence in Lysander's office. The investigation was moving quickly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were already too late, that while we were gathering evidence, my baby was being driven further away from me with every passing minute. Mrs. Ashworth? Officer Rodriguez looked up from his notes. Do you have any idea where your husband might take your son? Any secondary properties, relatives in other states, places he's mentioned recently? I started to shake my head, then remembered something that had seemed insignificant at the time. 3 weeks ago, Lysander had mentioned visiting a client in a neighboring state, a project that would require several site visits over the coming months. He'd been vague about the details, dismissing my questions about the timeline and location with his usual deflections. He mentioned a client project, I said slowly, trying to recall the specifics of conversations I hadn't paid close attention to. Something about a development in Pennsylvania, maybe 2 hours from here. He said it would require multiple trips. Do you have any documentation about this project? Client names, addresses, anything that might help us track down the location? I was already moving toward Lysander's filing cabinet, pulling open drawers and searching through folders for anything that might provide a lead. Most of the files contained routine business documents, contracts, blueprints, correspondence with local clients. But in the bottom drawer, I found a folder marked Riverside Development that contained information about a project I'd never heard him mention by name. The development was located in rural Pennsylvania, about 90 minutes from our home, on a large parcel of land that was being converted into luxury vacation homes. The project timeline showed construction beginning in early spring, which meant most of the infrastructure was currently incomplete, an isolated location with minimal supervision, perfect for activities that required privacy. This could be it, I said, handing the folder to Officer Rodriguez. If they're meeting someone to exchange money for my son, they'd need a place where they wouldn't be observed or interrupted. As the police officers coordinated their response, calling for units in Pennsylvania and issuing alerts to state agencies, I felt the first stirring of hope since discovering Orion's empty crib. We had a destination, a timeline, and law enforcement resources mobilizing to intercept whatever transaction was supposed to occur. But underneath the hope was a grief so profound I could barely acknowledge it. Grief for the husband I'd thought I knew, for the family I'd believed we were, for the innocence my children had lost in a single afternoon. Even if we found Orion safely, even if we stopped this horrible plan from succeeding, nothing would ever be the same. The foundation of our life together had been built on lies so fundamental that I wasn't sure anything authentic could be salvaged from the wreckage. Mommy? Isadora appeared in the doorway, escorted by Mrs. Patterson, who looked pale and shaken. Are the police going to find Orion? Yes, sweetheart, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. They're going to bring him home. And Daddy? Her question was asked with such careful neutrality that I realized she already suspected the answer. Daddy made some very bad choices, I said, kneeling down to hold her close. But that doesn't change how much I love you, or how much we're going to take care of each other. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of police activity and agonizing waiting. Officers searched the house for additional evidence while others coordinated with Pennsylvania law enforcement to locate the Riverside Development site. I provided detailed descriptions of both Lysander and Evangeline, photographs from our family albums, and every piece of information I could remember about their possible destination. At 4:30, Officer Rodriguez received a radio call that made him turn toward me with an expression of cautious optimism. We've located your husband's vehicle at the development site, he said. Units are moving in now. The wait for confirmation seemed to last forever, though it was probably only 10 minutes before his radio crackled again with an update that changed everything. Suspects in custody, baby is safe and unharmed. I collapsed into Lysander's desk chair, overwhelmed by relief so powerful it felt like a physical force. Orion was alive. He was safe. The police had found him before any exchange could take place, before he could disappear into whatever network of buyers had been waiting to receive him. But as the relief faded, it was replaced by a different kind of anguish. The realization that my husband, the father of my children, was now among the suspects who had been taken into custody. The man I'd loved for over a decade had been willing to sell our baby for money, to destroy our family for financial gain that I still didn't fully understand. Will I be able to see Orion today? I asked Officer Rodriguez, needing to hold my son, to confirm with my own eyes and hands that he was truly safe. Absolutely. There will be some paperwork to complete, and we'll need to have him examined by medical personnel to ensure he wasn't harmed, but you should be reunited within the next few hours. As if reading my thoughts, he added gently, Your husband and the young woman are being transported back here for questioning. You'll want to contact an attorney, and we can recommend counseling services to help your family process what's happened. The practical aspects of dealing with the aftermath were already beginning to feel overwhelming. Criminal proceedings, divorce paperwork, therapy for the children, rebuilding a life that had been shattered in a single afternoon. The list of challenges seemed endless. But as I looked at Isadora, who was sitting quietly in the corner, drawing in a notebook Mrs. Patterson had brought her, I felt a familiar determination rising in my chest. My daughter had tried to warn me about Evangeline, had sensed the danger when I'd dismissed her concerns as childhood anxiety. She'd saved our family with her intuition and her courage, and I owed it to her to be equally brave in facing whatever came next. Sweetheart, I said, sitting down beside her and looking at the picture she was creating. What are you drawing? Our family, she said simply, showing me a carefully rendered image of 3 figures, herself, me, and a baby I recognized as Orion. The way we're supposed to be. There was no 4th figure in the drawing, no space left for someone who had chosen greed over love, betrayal over responsibility. My 6-year-old daughter had already understood what it had taken me hours to accept, that families weren't defined by biology or legal documents, but by the people who chose to protect and care for each other. At 7:15 that evening, a police cruiser pulled into our driveway carrying the most precious cargo I could imagine. I ran to the car before it had fully stopped, and when Officer Rodriguez placed Orion in my arms, I felt something fundamental click back into place in the universe. My baby was exactly as I'd left him, healthy, alert, and blissfully unaware of the danger he'd been in. He smiled when he saw me, reaching up to grab my hair with the same eager curiosity he'd shown that morning, and I held him so tightly that he began to fuss in protest. He's been fed and changed, Officer Rodriguez reported. The medical examination showed no signs of distress or harm. As far as we can tell, he was never in any immediate physical danger. Isadora pressed against my side, reaching up to touch her brother's hand and whisper, I told you we'd find him. Her matter-of-fact tone suggested she'd never really doubted the outcome, though I suspected her confidence had been more about protecting herself emotionally than genuine certainty. That night, after the police had finished their initial interviews and the immediate crisis had passed, I sat in Orion's nursery feeding him his bedtime bottle while Isadora curled up in the rocking chair beside us. The 3 of us together in the room where our ordeal had begun, but everything was different now. What's going to happen to Daddy? Isadora asked, her voice small in the dim light. He's going to have to face consequences for what he did, I said carefully, trying to find words that would be honest without being too frightening. He'll probably have to go to jail for a while, and he won't be living with us anymore. Because he was going to sell Orion? The bluntness of her question took my breath away, but I realized there was no point in trying to soften the reality of what had happened. Isadora had already seen too much, understood too much to be protected by gentle euphemisms. Yes, I said simply, because he was going to sell Orion. Are you sad? She asked, studying my face in the soft glow of the nightlight. I considered the question seriously, taking inventory of the complex emotions that had been churning through me all day. Sadness was certainly part of it. Grief for the husband I'd thought I knew, for the father I'd believed my children had, for the life we'd been living that had turned out to be built on lies. But underneath the sadness was something else, something that felt almost like relief. The tension that had been building in our house for months, the sense that something was fundamentally wrong beneath the surface of our daily routines, finally had an explanation. The disconnection I'd felt from Lysander, the way conversations seemed to skate across important topics without ever really landing, all of it made sense now. I'm sad about some things, I told Isadora, but I'm not sad that we're safe, and I'm not sad that we found out the truth. Sometimes knowing the truth is better than living with lies, even when the truth is difficult. Will we be okay? She asked. Just the three of us? I looked around the nursery, at the crib where Orion was already drowsing in my arms, at the photographs on the walls showing happier times that now seemed like scenes from someone else's life, at my daughter whose wisdom and courage had saved us all. Yes, I said, and for the first time in months, I felt certain about something related to our future. We're going to be more than okay. We're going to be honest with each other, and we're going to take care of each other, and we're going to build something real together. 3 months later, I stood in the kitchen of our same house, preparing breakfast for my children on a snowy January morning. The house itself looked almost identical to how it had appeared during those terrible October days, but everything else had changed in ways both visible and invisible. Lysander was in prison, having pleaded guilty to charges of conspiracy to commit kidnapping and child trafficking in exchange for a reduced sentence. The investigation had revealed that he'd accumulated significant gambling debts over the past 3 years, losses he'd hidden from me with the same skill he'd used to hide his plans for Orion. The money in his secret account had come from selling information about wealthy families to criminal networks that specialized in kidnapping children for illegal adoption. Evangeline had been a paid participant rather than a willing conspirator, recruited through social media by people who'd identified her family's financial struggles and her grandmother's medical expenses. Her role had been to establish trust with target families and provide access during predetermined windows. She was serving 2 years in juvenile detention, and her testimony had helped authorities identify and arrest 6 other people involved in the network. The house felt lighter somehow without the constant undercurrent of tension that had characterized our life with Lysander. Isadora laughed more frequently, her artwork had become brighter and more optimistic, and Orion was developing into a cheerful, curious baby who seemed to thrive in the calmer atmosphere. I'd returned to work part-time as a graphic designer, a career I'd abandoned when Isadora was born, but found I could resume with surprising ease. The income wasn't enough to maintain our previous lifestyle, but it was enough to keep the house and provide stability for the children. More importantly, it gave me a sense of independence and purpose that had been missing during my years as a full-time mother and wife. "Mommy, can we visit Mrs. Patterson today?" Isadora asked, looking up from her cereal bowl where she was arranging berries in careful patterns. "I want to show her my new drawing. Mrs. Patterson had become an unofficial grandmother figure to both children, stepping in to provide childcare when needed, and offering the kind of consistent, unconditional support that had helped us navigate the most difficult months of our lives. Her presence next door felt like a safety net, knowing that help was always just a few steps away. "After lunch," I agreed, adjusting Orion in his high chair and wiping applesauce from his chin. But first we have an appointment with Dr. Martinez. Dr. Martinez was the family therapist we'd been seeing since November, a gentle woman who specialized in helping children process trauma and helping families rebuild after betrayal. The sessions were sometimes difficult, forcing us to confront painful realities and work through complex emotions, but they were also healing in ways I hadn't expected. Is she going to ask about my dreams again? Isadora wanted to know. Probably. Are you still having the scary ones? Not as much, Isadora said thoughtfully. Last night I dreamed we were flying, all three of us together. It was nice. The nightmares had been frequent in the first weeks after Lysander's arrest. Vivid dreams about losing Orion or being unable to protect him from unseen dangers. But they'd gradually decreased as Isadora processed her fears and began to trust that our new life was stable and secure. Dr. Martinez says dreams can help us understand our feelings, I said, echoing the therapist's gentle explanations. Even the scary ones can teach us important things. Like how Daddy's feelings were sick? Isadora asked with a directness that continued to amaze me. We'd worked hard to help her understand that Lysander's choices had been the result of problems inside himself, rather than anything she or Orion had done wrong. Dr. Martinez had explained addiction and desperation in terms a 6-year-old could grasp, helping Isadora separate her father's actions from his love for her. Exactly like that, I confirmed. People sometimes make terrible decisions when they're scared or sick, but that doesn't mean the people they hurt deserved it. After breakfast, I loaded both children into the car for the drive to Dr. Martinez's office, a routine that had become as familiar as our weekly grocery trips. Orion babbled contentedly in his car seat while Isadora pointed out interesting things through the window. A dog wearing a sweater, icicles hanging from a neighbor's roof, a snowman that had been built in someone's front yard. "Mommy," she said as we pulled into the parking lot, "are you happy now?" The question caught me off guard, partly because of its directness and partly because I realized I didn't have a simple answer. Happiness seemed like too small a word for the complex mixture of emotions that characterized my daily experience. Relief, certainly. Gratitude for my children's safety and resilience. Pride in what we'd survived and how we'd grown stronger together. But also grief for what we'd lost, anxiety about the future, and a wariness about trusting people that might never fully disappear. The betrayal had taught me that the people closest to us could harbor secrets that fundamentally altered reality, and that knowledge was both sobering and empowering. "I'm peaceful," I said finally, pulling into a parking space and turning to look at both of my children. "I'm grateful we're together, and I'm proud of how brave you've been, and I'm excited about all the good things that are going to happen in our future." "That sounds like happiness to me," Isadora said with the simple wisdom that had become her trademark. As we walked into Dr. Martinez's office, Orion balanced on my hip and Isadora skipping beside us, I reflected on how much our definition of family had evolved since that terrible October afternoon. We were smaller now, just the three of us, but we were also more honest, more connected, more intentional about protecting and caring for each other. The betrayal that had threatened to destroy us had ultimately revealed strengths I didn't know we possessed. Isadora's courage and intuition, my own capacity for decisive action under pressure, Orion's resilience and adaptability. We'd discovered that we were capable of surviving the unthinkable and building something beautiful from the pieces. 6 months later, on a warm spring evening, I sat on our front porch watching Isadora push Orion in his baby swing while he shrieked with delight. The azaleas were blooming pink and white along our property line, and the evening light cast everything in a golden glow that made ordinary moments feel touched with magic. My phone buzzed with a text message from my lawyer, updating me on the final details of my divorce proceedings. The legal paperwork was nearly complete. The house was officially mine, and the custody arrangement reflected the reality that Lysander would likely remain incarcerated for several more years. But as I watched my children play together in the yard where we'd made so many memories, both painful and joyful, I realized that the legal documentation was just formality. Our real family, the one built on truth and trust and daily choices to love each other, had already been established through everything we'd survived together. "Mommy, look!" Isadora called out, pointing to something in the sky above us. "The first stars are coming out." I looked up to see Venus appearing bright and steady in the deepening blue of twilight, the evening star that had always seemed like a symbol of hope and guidance. As I sat there with my children in the place we'd learned to call home again, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the absolute certainty that we were exactly where we belonged, and that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them, together with courage, honesty, and love. The story that had begun with betrayal and terror had become something else entirely, a testament to the power of family bonds that choose truth over comfort, justice over convenience, and love over everything that tries to destroy it. We'd lost the family we thought we were, but we'd found the family we were meant to be. And that, I realized, was the most precious discovery of all.